Hey, we're live.
Let's go,
Hello.
besties. Let's go, besties.
Okay, we will wait for everybody to trickle in. But hello, welcome to our live show for Dune, um, the epic sci-fi novel by Frank Herbert. If you guys are new to the stream, hello, I'm Blake. I don't know how you found this channel, but hi. uh, my name is Blake, and my channel is Blake the Book Eater, and this is the Vintage Books and Wine live show. Sadly, Ace could not join us, but my co-host Tiana and Matthew are here. So, guys, introduce yourselves.
Who wants to go first?
You go ahead.
Okay, hi, my name is Tiana. If I sound weird, I have a sinus infection, but we're okay. I'm a student at Trump University. I have a booktube channel where I talk about books, TV shows, anything in between. Instagram, we're kind of off Instagram right now, but Twitter, it's a fun place to be at on Twitter. So yeah, I'll pass it off to Matthew.
Hi, I'm Matthew. You can find me at my very cleverly named booktube channel, Matthew Sciarappa, which is just my name. Also, that is my Instagram account. I do books as well on the internet, and it's lovely to be here. So excited to talk about Dune.
Yeah. And yeah, my channel is Blake the Book Eater. Like, look at the channel description. Hi. But yeah, so this month's pick was Dune. Also, if one of you could blast out in the Discord that we're live right now, just wanted to go. I was putting it on the socials, but yeah. So Dune. This is the first book in a 6-book sci-fi fantasy series, but it also kind of is perfectly works as a standalone. We'll talk about it. We'll discuss. But yeah, so what are some of our initial thoughts? Because I know I've read this before, like way back when I was in high school. And I know, Matthew, you've read this before. But Tiana, this was your first time kind of reading it and being introduced to the story. So yeah, let's start with your initial thoughts.
So I went in knowing little as possible, as I typically do. And I knew it was an older book. When I actually put a link in the Discord of like the story behind Dune getting published, and this is all thoughts after, but like before, I was just like, okay, I know it's gonna be slow. I know it's gonna be like meaningful symbolisms and literary devices in this book. So I was prepared for a very dense, heavy world building novel. Especially, I forget what year specifically it was published, but I do know the time frame of like the Cold War. So I was expecting to draw parallels from that time period into his writing. But fun fact, this book was actually published in a car manual, believe it or not. And when I found that, I was like, that checks out. That makes sense. For me, going into this, I was just prepared for lots of heavy world building, lots of character arcs per se, introductions to characters. But yeah, those are my thoughts going into the book.
But what were your actual like thoughts?
Oh, thoughts. Yeah. So for me, it was very deliberate. It was very slow. And then I was researching like what this author's intent was for this book. He was like, yeah, I want it to be very slow. And at the end of it, it all just like clashed together. And I enjoyed that. But for me, I gave it 4 stars. I'm going to say that right now. But for me, I was like, I like tying everything together as we like progressively work in the plot. For me, that first like 3-4 paragraphs, I was like, or 3-4 chapters, I was like, okay, this is what's going to happen. I expected what I saw in the end happen, and I saw from my way. So I was like, okay, I'm here for the long haul. So I'm here, and I enjoyed myself. So yeah.
Matthew, what did you think?
So I read Dune, I don't know, way back when in the school days, and I think a lot of it definitely went over my head. And I didn't remember much of it. I think this time around, I was surprised at how accessible it was. I was surprised about how like, yeah, it's long and it doesn't move exactly like fastly, but it is not hard to read. And I was kind of expecting what I think is the cliche of sci-fi, which is like so many bizarre names and things you have to figure out and technology. And like, no, a lot of it's like incredibly straightforward and easily understood. I gave it a 2.5. I found that I mean, there were lots of things that I enjoyed about it, but lots of things that I found icky. And also, I never really felt like I had an immersive experience. I very much while reading it was thinking of the type of reader who would like Dune more than me and what their experience is like. And I couldn't really like separate myself from like the meta narrative of the cultural phenomenon that is Dune.
Yeah.
I couldn't really like enjoy Dune for Matthew's sake. I was more curious about like, what is the cult of Dune? What is like the Frank Herbert like worship factory like? So I think that definitely took away from my experience, just like knowing too much about what Dune exists as in the world. But I don't regret reading it by any means. I'm like very glad that I now like could talk to somebody about Dune and like have a perspective and stance that is based on what I read in the text. I am very skeptical of it as a continuous cultural phenomenon. And I'm curious to see what we'll talk about today and whether or not that'll influence my overall feelings.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Yeah, so for me, like, I mean, I read this novel like way back when I was in high school, and even then, like, I was surprised at how fast it was. Like, everybody says that Dune is slow, but even like reading it again now, it was so fast. Like, the pace, at least for me, like the pacing was really like, it was deliberate, but it was done in a way that made me want to read more. And I think like the first half of the book, like part one, like the first book, in like part one of three, like it was so deliberate in all of the conversations and positioning all these players on the board and their different philosophies about a lot of different things, so that when you're kind of thrust into like a different like side of the world in like the second half of the book, you feel like you have such a good foundation of like what came before, and just because the narrative changes so much, that yeah, I just like really enjoyed like what it was. And it was really interesting to me because there was a lot of like the themes and subtext that like I kind of knew about, but like I hadn't really picked up on my first reading of Dune, and on my second read it was a lot more obvious. Like I wasn't taking his stuff like, you know, just at the base value. I was kind of like reading more into stuff. And then I did actually read the sequel right afterwards, and I think that really helped with like amplifying a lot of the themes. But yeah, so I really liked it. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. So yeah, Matthew, I guess I'm one of the people who would enjoy it more, because I like sci-fi fantasy, like just in general. So
Totally.
Yeah. So let's kind of get into I think that was like kind of the end of our non-spoilery side of things. So I think, you know, well, yeah, because it's hard to talk about Dune without talking about spoilers.
Yeah.
So I think we can get into the discussion now. And if you guys would, you know, like to stick around or just get yourself spoiled, like feel free to stick around. So yeah, I think first let's start with the beginning of the book. A good portion of the first half of book one takes place on Caladan, which is like their homeworld, even before we get to Arrakis, and we're introduced to all the different characters: Paul, Duke Leto, Lady Jessica, Thufir Hawat, Duncan Idaho, the Dr. Yue. I think that's most of them.
I will say, for the length of this book, it corresponds with the large cast of this book, which I appreciated, because I was surprised to see multiple POVs. Granted, this is before denoting whose POV it was, like right off the bat. So I was just like, wait, who's speaking? It didn't help that I did the audiobook, but that audiobook was long, okay? The first 2 hours was the first 50 pages. I said, I'll just read it with my eyeballs. I can't. So I did like that as a reader, where like we had a large cast that helped make the book digestible for me, because for me, I'm just like, wait, who said what, when, where, why not, how? So yeah.
Yeah, it was really interesting as from a writing perspective that he switched POVs like within the same page. Like it would be the same scene and it would be like you were in Lady Jessica's brain, and then it would switch to like Duke Leto and like what he was thinking, and you were like, like I'm not used to reading books that will switch POVs so quickly like that. So that was like also just because like it's going to be really interesting seeing how Denis Villeneuve puts this on screen, because so much of this takes place like internally and what the characters are thinking and like the mental gymnastics that are going on there.
I also think it's just like such a product of the 1960s to have two of your main characters be named Jessica and Paul in a giant science fiction universe.
Yeah.
And I was a little bit jarred. I don't think I remembered that like in a, you know, or as like a thing, but like some of the characters do have a little bit more flamboyancy in their names. Like there's a little bit more of that sci-fi touch that we expect, but like hearing about Paul going off and doing his Paul stuff is a little bit funny to me. I don't know. Side note.
Well, see, that's interesting, because there's another person who was like talking to me about that, and I was kind of looking into it more, and I think it was very deliberate that he chose the name Paul as a reference to the biblical Paul, like because the apostle Paul, like he was Saul, and then like the scales fell from his eyes, and he became like a Messiah type figure, and I think that was very in line with Paul's positioning as a Messiah figure in this book. Also, one of my favorite things when I was, because one of the most common criticisms that I see of Dune is that it's kind of like a savior narrative. But like rereading it and like really like listening to what the characters are saying, like it's very, at least to me, like obvious that you're not supposed to root for Paul 100%, like because the Bene Gesserit totally manipulate the Fremen culture, you know, for thousands of years to plant the seeds of like him being a Messiah, and they like use like that, like he's not an actual Messiah, he's like using this people to further his own means, and so like that was like really interesting to read on this.
Okay, so I will say yes, that like I do think that this book seeks to critique that element. However, unfortunately, a lot of it is still structured like a white savior or savior narrative. Like even if that critique is happening, the plotting of the book is built upon what we kind of come to know those narratives to be, and it can be a little bit like fussy to read. That despite like inserted lines or slight dialogue commentary or intuition as a reader, like he still goes to this mysterious land to learn about a mysterious mythology and then use that mythology to conquer a land. Like it's like it is kind of, there is something that I found off-putting, if only because I found it to be something familiar. Granted, this book came before a lot of the books that I have read that made me familiar with those tropes, but you know, reading it now, I do think that there is an issue structurally with that in place. I also do think that oftentimes because I've had this conversation with a couple of readers based on the review that I posted on my Instagram, and a lot of people refer to the sequels far more than this first book as a way to justify the commentary on savior narratives. And I'm sure that I'm very curious as to like what happens in those sequels, and I have heard, you know, that great commentary ensues, but like a sequel does not a first book make. And I think at the end of the day, this first book is a savior narrative. Like, sure, set up to fail, but like reading it, that is what you're getting.
Yeah. At least for me though, like it was interesting because I did read the sequel, but like the stuff I'm referring to like is actually in the first book, because I was like taking notes and stuff. But like for me, there was just like there are so many like little moments where like I don't know, I don't feel like you're necessarily supposed to like Paul, at least in the second half. Like once he's like awakened, he becomes a lot more cold, and like that characters reference that, like I know Duncan does, or not Duncan, Gurney Halleck, because it's very much like Paul starts thinking about like in the grand scheme of things and like what's going to happen in the future. Like every action that he does has a ripple effect, and like he lets like a lot of people die, and he's worried about the you know, the, oh my god, what is it, like the spice harvester, and like worried about losing profits. And Gurney is very much like, okay, but like your dad, like, you know, in the earlier scene, you know, his like Duke Leto was only worried about the men and like the lives of those men and protecting everybody he could. And it was like very much a direct contrast to that. And you see Paul kind of like losing himself in like this slipstream of the future where he's only worried about what's to come and like not really concerned with like actual people's lives. And like Jessica even says a couple times that she's like scared of her own son, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah, you know, whether or not you root for Paul, I think is a different question as to like whether or not we're supposed to care for Paul.
Yeah.
And I feel like, I mean, most, not all, most characters are built with a certain amount of empathy towards them. And I think that like Jessica does play a nice foil to what Paul ends up becoming. Thinking specifically of the scene when he duels Jameis, which is like probably my favorite scene in the book and probably what I found to be most riveting. Like he kills Jameis, starts to feel a certain amount of victory upon conquering, you know, over someone, and Jessica swoops in to like take him down emotionally. And I found that dynamic to be like a break of their mother-son relationship to the fullest extent. But at the same time, like that is a very motherly thing to do. So I feel like that dynamic, you know, was what made me so excited about this book in general. But like, I think that Paul is still like, even though people are scared of him, even though he is behaving in a way that is cold, as readers, like he is our main character. He is like coddled in a certain way, which I just find the dynamic to be very interesting.
It was actually funny because I think I was reading like some stuff about Dune, and originally Liet Kynes was supposed to be the protagonist of Dune before he went and changed it. And like that's so fascinating to me because I think Kynes is like one of the most interesting characters in the book, and like his perspective and his story is so fascinating to me, and I loved his final chapter. And yeah, so like I loved Liet Kynes and like his whole ecology of wanting to terraform like the planet. Also, I loved that there was that kind of subversion of like they like, because all you know of the Fremen are from like what the Atreides and the Harkonnens know, and they're like, oh, they're just desert people, they don't really know much, but like secretly like they're fucking blackmailing the guild and like having control of the satellites and the planet to like keep the secret of them trying to like revitalize their planet. And yeah, there were so many schemes and schemes upon schemes in this book.
Yeah, the schemes were, you know me, I will sniff out shit a mile away. So I was just like, crazy how we're getting this now. How's it gonna play out later? And again, it's a very slow, deliberate pacing. Then you just get this hodgepodge, which is like slit at the end. You're just like, what the fuck? We experienced this all as a whole. So I was like, shit, we got here. How did we get here? And then you gotta track back, and then I don't edit my books, but with this one I did. So I was like, "Oh, bitch, how'd you miss this part? And what happened?" And that's the what was it in English? That's the better part of having multiple POVs and knowing what the character's gonna do, because you see it. You're like, okay, I see you, bits. What you gonna do? How are we gonna counteract these plans upon schemes? So I really enjoyed those parts.
Yeah, I think one of the best scenes that did that was the dinner scene where there's like a bunch of people in the Atreides house, and pretty much all of that dialogue is all internal thoughts and like little signs and references and subtle counterplays. Yeah, what the hell? Yeah, and that scene, unfortunately, because it's out, like the movie is out internationally, and that scene is not in the movie, which I understand why they don't have it, because it would be like impossible to do. But yeah, what would you guys say are like some of your most anticipated scenes or moments that you want to see in the movie? Or
I'm so curious about how they're going to do all of the kind of like dialectical work with the magic system of Jessica and Paul manipulating their voices. Like,
yeah,
I want to know, like, is it just going to be like a lame like echo that they put over the voices and it makes people like, ooh, like magic? Or is it like, because like the way that I found it to be so exciting was the way that Frank Herbert like talked about like lilts and shifts in tone, and like the way that, you know, certain lines were drawn out. And you know, I found that intricacy to be like fun, and something that I wish were even perhaps more developed in terms of like Paul's training. So I'm curious like what device directorially will be used to show that persuasion, because it's not like magic, but it is kind of magic. I think that's like the biggest thing for me.
For me, I'm all about like visuals. Like I want to see like how they're going to make these devices and how they're going to make these planets look. Like when you're given Desert Planet as your like thesis, it's like, okay, well, what else can you run with that? Like how can you make the textures like pop? How can you make the contrast in the character and make that character be the outsider, then adapt to being an insider? Especially with Zendaya doing this, I'm scared for her, because she's very picky about her role, especially being, I say this nicely, as being the token Black actress that Hollywood loves to use her for. I'm scared to see how they will use her in this adaptation because of the way that her character is portrayed in the series. I did some digging because I'm gonna be honest, I'm not gonna finish the trilogy. I'm not. So the way that they decide to XYZ redacted, I'm like, oh, okay. So it really wasn't like love involved in this situation. Okay, I
But the second book was really interesting from that perspective and seeing what happens with her character. Just because, and also, sorry T, but like Zendaya is barely gonna be in the movie.
I know. So I'm just like, use her token goodness for tickets. I don't care. But after this,
well, it's because like most of the like. Basically where they cut it off, they end the movie at the Jamis duel, and then book 2 is going to be the rest of it.
So they're just gonna waste my time with this movie?
No, I mean, like, I like the idea. I do like the idea of, because the Jamis duel is like, it is my favorite scene. So like, I do want to see that scene. And I also do think of it as a very pivotal moment.
Yeah.
The first time he kills somebody is like a big effing deal. And the fact that like Jessica as a character was like, I have been waiting for this moment my entire life and I need to get to him in the next 30 seconds or else he's going to become the most corrupt and terrible person alive. Like, that's fun to me. I don't know if I see it as like a cinematically as like a good end place. So like, I am curious if the movie is very much like cutting so that we can get a part 2, or if it's trying to be like its own encompassing movie. I don't know.
No, it's 100% a part 1. Like,
okay,
so
yeah,
they're doing a part 1 and a part 2, and then Denis, he wants to do to round out the movie trilogy by ending with Dune Messiah, which.
But do we have the budget for this though? Like
well, it depends on if the movie does well.
Which is the problem, because you have freaking Jupiter Ascending did well in the box office, I think, and then didn't do a sequel.
Well, here's the thing,
a dying trilogy.
It's already doing good at the box office internationally. It's been open for a couple weeks internationally, and so it opens in the US.
Who's the studio producing is the question.
Warner Brothers.
Oh, so they got money. They just see Warner Brothers and me have a problem, right? They're too goddamn money hungry that they can't plan and sit down and fucking arc. You have, I don't want to get into it, but DC is shit. Okay, that's all I'm going to say.
This is its own book club. We'll talk about.
I really want to get the sequel just because the scene I'm most excited to see is Paul writing the great Shai Hulud for the first time when he rides the worm.
The worm, yeah.
That scene is like, it was just so just the worms are so cool. And also I love that like the ecology of, because I mean Frank Herbert wrote a whole essay about like he was inspired by the ecology of real life dunes and that kind of stuff. But like the way he described like the spice and the worms, like, and how they're kind of like so involved with the spice and the planet, like it felt very much like a very lived in world. Like it's like you could picture, like he thought about all the nature shit and how it fit together. And just the big ass worms. And
I want to see the tooth. I want to know what's going on with the tooth. I want to know, like, is it
The
whenever
poison gas
the
tooth.
poison in his tooth.
Yeah.
Because remember the tooth. Like
Yeah.
I thought that was like comical because they did find it to be corny, but it's also like kind of a cool device.
Yeah.
Curious if that's going to be in my head. That scene was quite pivotal, so I'm curious if it will be in the movie.
I think it's a cool scene too. Sorry, what were you gonna say, Blake?
Well, I was just gonna say, like, to me, it's also very interesting because I think the movie has a lot of chances to hide some of its secrets, because the movie tells us the book tells us right off the bat that Yue is the traitor over and over again. It's like Yue's gonna betray them, Yue's gonna betray them, and you get the motivation, and you're like, when is it gonna happen? Like, how is it gonna happen? But like that's all like internal, and so like I wonder how they're gonna do that, because like I also really liked Yue.
Me too. It read like Hamilton to me, I'm not gonna lie, because you just right off the bat because if you've read like Ron Chur, I can't pronounce his name, if you read that book, it tells you off the bat what's gonna happen, how it happened, and then you have to backtrack and be like, okay, well, we have to establish these relationships, we have to have this plot twist, we have to have this whole hip opera, even though I don't think this is the characters, and then you just go throughout the entire like journey of that. So to me,
it's the first time anybody has compared Dune and Hamilton.
I mean, all great tragedies.
I played all these, so it's just like a beaut. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, it's also American history. Like you know the guy gets shot, so like it's not...
Well, no, I didn't know about Hamilton until I was studying Latin, which I hated so much. Anyway, back to the topic. I think the biggest thing for me will be the execution of the technology and the visuals of this film. And I think that's what like gets these movies the hype, is the visuals. Because for sci-fi, it's always okay, but how does that look on screen? How can we convey these hallucinogens on paper into film? Which I'm excited to see.
Yeah. Well,
Acting, couldn't give two shits about. It's sci-fi. Like,
because we get
Timothée Chalamet. I don't care.
Well, we're getting the whole like the fall of House Atreides. And that to me, it was so interesting in the book, because like Herbert shied away from like big battle scenes or anything until like the very, very end, and even then he didn't dwell on like a lot of the action stuff for very long. He was more focused on like Paul and Jessica trying to get away and their like flight in the ornithopter. And that whole like scene with the agents like hunting them down and stuff. I thought that was, and it was like stuff like that where like it made me keep wanting to read over, like, you know, next page, next chapter. Oh, I'm the next part is only 30 pages away. Let me just sit down for another 30 minutes, you know? And so, yeah, it was like one of those things oh yeah. T, you got to show us the dog now.
I don't know if he'll let me do it, but this is Bo.
Aww.
This is the content people are really tuning in for.
Literally, like, this is my job. This is how I pay my rent. Say hi. I don't even see him, but he's like, can I lift you up? Or are you gonna be mad at me? Say hi. No.
Look at that face.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wait, was I mute? I was not on mute.
But yeah, I guess, do you guys have any questions for the rest of us? Well,
so like,
I know you had some criticism, so do you want to get into that?
Oh, happy to talk about criticisms. Let's talk about the Baron. Let's talk about Vladimir Harkonnen, who is the most two-dimensional villain I think I have ever stumbled across. Literally, like, grabbing his crotch and thinking about having sex with little boys while he plots like, oh my god, like, you know that alone, there can be a lot of commentary to be said about like the villainization about like homosexuality, and I don't even think that needs to be addressed in this conversation, but like it was just almost dull to read through his scenes. I tweeted about it and I was like, if we just replaced his scenes with mwahaha, I don't know what I would have missed.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know if anybody else thought that he had more characterization, but like,
no.
I was left wanting a far more complex villain.
It was giving Megamind, and me being the child that I am, I that shit up. I said, okay, go watch this. Give me not the pedophile, no, like the whole like stupid ha ha ha. Yes, please give me that. Because if you're just gonna tell me your whole plan, okay, I can anticipate what you're gonna where you're gonna go wrong and what you're gonna do wrong. Or right. But yeah, it was giving Megamind. And it was funny.
I mean, like, no, it's just, I don't know. I don't understand why his characterization was like what it was when with a book that is so concerned about political intrigue and has plots upon plots. Like, to have a big bad be like that is, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, especially if you're going to introduce a hero that is as complex as Herbert is trying to create.
Yeah.
You know, to have a villain that is
2D
as dull as that is really frustrating. And you know, other things too, like, you know, I think the undertones of eugenics being like a really neat thing is like not my fave. You know, the birthing and choosing the best people at birth to give powers to and getting rid of other babies. And
I don't think that was a good thing.
No, but the fact that it, again, thinking of like structurally what this book does, like, it is a good thing in terms of like this I don't know. I think that it walks into some gray territory that I wish were developed within this book. And I can foresee a lot of development in later books. And I see that we're being hinted nicely. And you know, maybe I'm just asking too much to like have a more you know, morally salient novel, right? But like, we also do have a big bad who is like rubbing his crotch and wants to have sex with little boys. Like, it's you know, when something is as clear as that, and I don't know, I just feel like we're lost a little bit.
To me, it almost felt like it's reminds me of this dumbass movie that came out like a month and a half ago, Don't Breathe 2, where I don't know if you saw the first one. So like, basically the blind old man is a terrible person who like awful person. He's the villain. But in the second one, they pitted him against even worse people to make you kind of root for him. And so like, that was the vibes I was getting when I was reading Dune again, just because it was like, you have like Paul, well, not in this book, he's not doing terrible things, but like, he's like worried about the jihad that's going to like kill so many people. And then you also have like, you know, the Baron, who's cartoonishly evil. And so it's almost like the Baron is so easy to root against that you just kind of like go with Paul, even though Paul is not necessarily like the best hero protagonist. And yeah, that definitely, I'll give you a hint. In the second book, there's at one point where Paul is talking about, you know, people in the past, because his jihad has already kind of extended and killed like billions of people, and he compares himself to Genghis Khan and Hitler, and he's like, oh, they were rookie numbers, like I did much better than them. So yeah, like when you have your hero comparing himself and saying he did better than Hitler, that, you know,
that's a pretty on the nose. Yeah, I don't know. I find this book to be clumsy in many ways, and I'm very curious about why it has such stay power. Like, how did Frank Herbert get so many people to fall in love with a series about addiction and worms? Like, how did
this one to me? I got you.
And like, you know, but I think of like Ursula K. Le Guin wrote The Left Hand of Darkness, what, 4 years later, and that doesn't nearly have as many reads as this does. I mean, obviously it's like an important sci-fi classic and many people read it and study it in schools, but like, you know, is it like a sexism thing? Like, he's a man, therefore has more going for him and therefore people care more? Or does this book just have something that I don't quite see? And when I say that I'm skeptical about its relevancy today, I just, you know, there have been far more complex, well-executed stories that I think exist now. Not that I don't think people should not read this book, because clearly it did have impact, but like, I don't know. I do you have any thoughts about like why this book has stuck around in the way that it has?
I
Well,
do. After,
oh,
after reading his
Uh-oh.
interview, after reading his interview, no ma'am. After reading this interview, I was like, hey. After reading this interview, I was like, he's very clumsy in how he said, I was lazy to write a good ending, so I'm gonna give you this bullshit. So he says, yeah, if you have any holes about the book, take that up on yourself and look inward as to why you think that those exist. So when I read that, I was just like, okay, just say you didn't know how to write a good ending or fill in the plot holes. And then on top of that, the misogyny in this book that I was picking up on, I was just like, listen, sex work is the only real work. Take that to the altar and pray about it. I don't care. So when there was like a pretext to the chapter coming up, it was like the queen or like the head matriarch needs to both be beautiful in age and beautiful in seduction skills. And when she loses one, she needs to rely on the other. And I was reading this, I was just like, ugh. And on top of that, you have Jessica being the concubine of her duke. I said, so why don't you just marry him? If he's pussy whipped, why don't you just marry him? Like, make it make sense.
Okay, but Jessica's the most complex character we get in this book. At least in this book.
I know. Believe me, I was upset. I was like,
no. I'm defending the depiction of Jessica. I think that she is a really well-developed character in comparison to other characters in this text. Also, Tiana, I'm curious. Like, I was asking about like the stay power of this text, and everything that you've mentioned so far would kill this text. So, like,
oh yeah, and that's why I'm saying it's staying, because no one wants to look in and defend it. They're just like, oh, I need to go on myself and be like, I need to research why and where it's going to stay within this like generation.
So you think it's like a propulsive, because it was good, people will continue to call it good?
Yeah, and they think it's because his response is look within yourself for those answers. That's why I think it has stay power.
Well, that doesn't mean people do that. Like, just because he's asked them to doesn't mean that people will.
The comments on the videos that I've been like researching, it's like, yeah, it's so good. If you look at the true message, I'm like, okay, but there is no true message. He wrote a book and could expound upon why it has X, Y, and Z. He said, look within yourself to figure out why you think that. So I'm just looking at him like, go off, bestie. Just say you didn't know how to tie it in. That's all you had to say. The guy who published this book was fired. Okay, like, I don't care. Take it to the altar and pray about it. I don't care. But yeah, I think it has stay power for those reasons.
But yeah, back to the Jessica concubine thing. I think it was really interesting because Leto was like, I would marry you, but like it was very much like the Bene Gesserit, like it was their kind of thing that wouldn't let Jessica do it, and Jessica like defied them by having Paul anyways. But yeah, I agree that with this comment.
Oh yeah.
But your status pissed me off. I was like, ugh.
But I think when it comes to staying power with Dune, I just think it's because the world is so well developed and like it's very, I don't know, it's grounded in a way that also one thing that I loved about this was the fact that there was no like machines, there was no AI, and we get hints that the machines like turned on them, and so they like it's all like analog now, and it gives it almost this kind of like fantasy type feel, just because we do have like space witches and like we don't have computers or AI, like it's just like, and we have like giant I think Herbert even described the sandworms as like the dragons that guard their mounds of treasure, and like that's the kind of vibe, and just it has like an interesting mix of like sci-fi and fantasy that I think works really well for the story that it's telling. And then also it really helps that a lot of the major sci-fi in like the 80s and set, like they all basically stole from Dune. Like the Dune did not go anywhere. But like, Star Wars, Star Trek, like a lot of them kind of riffed off and pulled a lot of things and themes and imagery from Dune. And so that's why I think it does have staying power, is because you see its influences throughout like the rest of science fiction. And so I think a lot of people like, regardless of the quality, they kind of go back and they're like, they want to see like how all these influences started.
Yeah, no, it's a good take. I think of the same way, at least in the fantasy world, of like Tolkien. Like, obviously, I'm a Tolkien stan. Like, flaws and all, I love. But I also do see it like, yes, there have been more complex and better stories told since Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
But so much of fantasy has been influenced by Lord of the Rings. You can't play a video game without encountering a giant spider. Yeah. Like it is kind of that thing. So like, yeah, going back to the source, I do think does create state power. But I'm also curious, like maybe as like a part two to the question, like this book also does in many ways outshine better stories that are told today, or like more complex stories, or better polished stories even. And I'm curious why, like, you know, Dune's getting the adaptation, Ursula K. Le Guin is not getting the adaptation, you know. And her story perhaps is a little bit more, it's maybe a little bit more heady. Maybe the whole gender thing makes people like uncomfy, and like perhaps Dune just is more comfortable in terms of what kind of things we want to see, you know. I don't know, but
I think also a good part of that is due to the fans actually wanting a good adaptation, because we had the Lynch adaptation, there's an adaptation from the sci-fi, and I think the reason it's been adapted so many times is because I feel like they see the potential in it, like especially like with the visuals and the kind of, and I like, if it wasn't Denis Villeneuve, I would be worried that they wouldn't really go into the more kind of like meta narrative about Messiah and stuff. But I have faith that hopefully he'll do that in the second and third movie, because I feel like if it was any other director, it would just be a straight Messiah story without any of the nuance. But like, if you've seen Denis Villeneuve's other movies, you know he can do nuance and he can do it pretty well. So like, I have faith in him. And also just I think there's a lot of the big visuals, and like it's a very philosophical and like kind of, you know, talky story, but it has a lot of those qualities that people like, that I feel like studios can market as like a big blockbuster. So I feel like even though they might not love it, I feel like for like Hollywood, it feels more marketable than something that hasn't been adapted. And that's why I think is getting another adaptation.
No, totally. Marketability is that's incredibly valid, and I agree.
I will add to this. No, sir. On top of that, sci-fi wasn't as big genre as it is right now. Like, there wasn't a need for a hero. Yes, after Age of Disillusionment, you can go argue that with your mama, I don't care. But right now, with the whole Infinity Wars, with the whole DC Comics, there's a need for nostalgia, and also the need to give the fandoms what they want, especially when there's a profitable fandom right there, prime for the picking.
Yes.
And on top of that, I will leave with this. Avatar, the Blue People movie, took how many decades to make, because we didn't have the technology for it to be there. And here we are, 2021, 2022 era, where we have it. I mean, I know it's only 2018 anyway, but now we have this technology where we can use it to like better our eyeballs and our imagination.
Yeah. But also I think totally that, oh my gosh, what was I gonna say? I lost it. Matthew, go.
That's okay. I was gonna say, like, I think Tiana does bring up an interesting point that like it is now cool to be into sci-fi, when like, and so, for so many years it was the very uncool thing to read something like Dune. So I guess like it is finding a new audience, perhaps, of like people who are more interested in reading about something like this, where like even like convention life, like science fiction conventions, were so niche and so, you know, closed in, and, you know, comic book nerds, as you suggested, were not appreciated. Yeah. So like in an age of internet, when people can find each other, all this stuff, like, yeah, I guess it does have a certain amount of propulsion, and I can see that being
also, I think they're definitely needing a new franchise, because Star Wars fell flat on its fucking face, and they're like, oh, maybe let's move on. And also I think Warner Brothers has been looking for something where they can actually like rival Disney. I mean, they already greenlit a prequel series about the Bene Gesserit, so that'll be interesting, I guess. But it was really interesting because they refused to give, like, Denis Villeneuve wanted to film parts 1 and 2 back to back, and they said, nah, wait for the box office. Yeah. So we're not going to get part 2. At this point, we are going to get a part 2 just because of how well it's already doing. Yeah. And when it opens in the US, it's going to do pretty well, I think. But
that brings me back to my point. Sorry. What were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to say, like, at this rate, we're not going to get part 2 until like 2024 or like.
I'll be graduated by then.
Yeah.
Oh my God. My point was being how we have these magical space witches, right?
Yeah.
And there is a long history of Jewish people and ties to witchery. And I'm curious to see if anyone noticed that theme there? Like, if we're going to add the religious context to this, do we see a Jewish theme there? Because now that you mentioned that, I was like, wait, witchery? Most Jewish people, I want to say this, historically, there was a tie between people who were Jewish and witchery and in witchcraft. So I'm just like, that's a theme that I'm seeing in this book now.
I did not see that at all.
I mean,
like they referenced Christianity a couple times, like the Orange Catholic Bible, Bible and that kind of stuff, and like there was also some references to like Islamic religion and Buddhism and the OC Bible kind of being an amalgamation of those and Christianity, which I thought was interesting. But I didn't.
Yeah, it is heavily like. I mean, one of the biggest critiques of Dune is how appropriative it is of Islam in its crafting. You know,
someone who is...
I am not knowledgeable enough about Islam to comment on it, but I see that as like the biggest biggest thing that people don't like about Dune is the portrayal of what is very, very close to an Earth thing.
Yeah. I thought that was food for thought as someone who has lived in a dual religious household, Catholic and Islam. I was like,
we do get like a weird amalgamation of religion, and I think part of me is intrigued by that and part of me is frustrated by it. Like, you have the opportunity to create entire worlds, and he is somehow still grounded in, especially if he's like referencing US conflicts in later books, like we do get, I don't know, maybe it's just like a product of this being one of the first of its kind in the 60s. Like, sure, fair, yeah.
I think
his name's Paul. So
ground it with Christianity. I think you have to ground it with religions or U.S. religions in general, or just common ones, because then you have the whole Christian Belt South saying this is witchcraft, we can't have this. I think that was probably an indicator of why it was published in a car manual first, because of the fear of how it would be received throughout very heavily.
Well, T, I don't know if you knew this, but a lot of the time, like in the early kind of part of the 19th century or the 20th century, like a lot of like pulp science fiction was published in like these random magazines, like pulp stuff. So like it was pretty common for like a lot of writers that we know is like famous now to like have their stuff in like random magazines and stuff until they were like put together and published in novels.
And for a book that was serialized, I don't read it I don't feel that while reading it as much as I thought I might, which I find interesting. I do think like the writing in general, like I said earlier, like it is incredibly approachable. I think also in some parts, like it's good. Like I say that with surprise. You know, because everyone always talks about like how didactic and like dull Dune is.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of like not actually in the text to be didactic and dull. I think one of my favorite tricks he does is he'll have a character, he'll mention that a character has asked a question and then jump to the answers of that question.
Yeah.
And based on the answers, you have to deduce as a reader, you know, what question was actually asked. And like little moments of that, of like kind of burying the lead, really do keep the text aloft in a way that I find to be like pleasurable.
Yeah.
You know, I do think that oftentimes it can be slow, but slow doesn't necessarily mean like poorly written. And I think that a lot of it was good. I don't know. I think people are very harsh about the writing in Dune. I don't think it's that bad. And I wonder if it's because of like the compiling of like at the beginning of every chapter, we get these kind of like wordy documents that hint towards the text and create world. And like maybe people are reading too much in those wordy documents, but like the dialogue's snappy. Like it's not that, you know, like it's pretty concise even. So I don't know. I am in defense of I am a Dune writing apologist,
but not a Dune plot apologist.
Oh God, no. I think it is incredibly dull. And I'm definitely like, I think like it is the minutia of characterizations like is the only thing that drove me forward. Like Jessica is the reason that this book got any stars from me. I think that she is a fascinating character. I was even considering reading prequels to learn more about her story. I'm not
We'll
going to
do
because I
that.
don't have time.
Well, no, but just from what I've heard from the community, like who like adore Dune, they hate the prequels or sequels, like anything not written by Frank Herbert, like anything that's written by his son Brian, like it's
Okay, but like, does that mean that I would like it, or is he just
I
like
don't
not a good
know.
writer? Is it like a Simon Tolkien, J.R.
Apparently,
situation?
apparently he's not a good writer. Like his
Bummer.
writing is bad, and also the plot, like, just is.
Okay, so I'm going to look up a Wikipedia article about the character of Jessica and learn about her backstory.
There you go. There you go. Work smarter, not harder. There you go.
All of my 2 stars were for Jessica.
No, that's same, literally same. Like, I gave this book that rating, and it's because I enjoyed that part of the book. Like, you know, the fact that like I was not expecting her to like end up rough and tumbling it in the desert, and even just like her reflections upon the difference of like water versus moisture were really interesting. And like, you know, obviously that comes from Frank Herbert's voice, but like the fact that it came from her character to present that thought is cool to me. I don't know. I think she's a great character.
The whole feminine culture about like conserving moisture, I think, was so fascinating. And it was really interesting because I went from reading Dune to reading The Terror, which like in this book, it's like you need water. And like I felt dry and thirsty all the time when I was reading this. And like I'm reading this and I'm in like the Arctic waste and I just feel cold all the time when I'm reading it. And I love like when an author, like with just their text, they make your body kind of feel a certain way. Like I was like, I always had a water bottle next to me because I was like, this book is going to make me thirsty.
Yeah. And it's like, it was done in like very simple ways too. Like the reverence around tears. Like, I thought that was just like simple, clean, really effective. It gave me a very instant sense of their world for them to revere crying as much as they did, you know?
I got a question again.
Yeah.
So when we compare the depictions of dryness and thirstiness, can we compare it to what did Matthew say? Sensationalism of Earth Eater. You said they're very sensual scenes and depictions of how they ate the earth. Would you say that these depictions in this book are comparable to the depictions in Earth Eater and how they're very descriptive?
No, I think that they were not descriptive. I think that for the most part, they were effective.
Okay.
But I don't think that they were beautiful. I don't think that they created sense. You know, I think that they were just good.
Okay.
You know?
Yeah, I really liked in Dune, especially because you had characters like Jessica and Paul who grew up on a world that rained all the time and had oceans. And so them like realizing the lack of that, or like the new importance of just their body's moisture, or like, you know, when they breathed hard or their palms were sweating, like it was just like little stuff that I think really built up the world. But yeah, Earth Eater, like those descriptions were almost sexual in the way that they were like
it was deliberate. Like that was a deliberate aesthetic choice to create synesthesia through words. Like that was the point of that. Yeah. Whereas this was very much like, I'm trying to convey information. Okay. And I think maybe that's where people draw a conclusion that the text is didactic, because it is effective at delivering information. Okay. And it's a lot of information. It is. Which I guess is what didactic means. Anyway, I'm talking in circles. I liked the writing. That's all I want to say.
Okay. Thank you, Matthew. I think we covered pretty much all of Dune and the plot. Yeah, I mean, because there's like big plot things, but I think we don't really need to get into them like as much. I mean, I think we're pretty good. I mean, we're almost at the hour mark. But yeah, so I think in the next month, Black Veins is going to be our October book of the month, live show and date TBD. And also, I think we might try to set up something on Discord, like a Dune watch along, because Dune will be available on HBO Max same day. Which is why, funnily enough, that's why they released it internationally, like over a month before the North America release date, is because they wanted everybody to spend all their money, and then North America, because piracy is going to go.
And I'm okay with that.
I want a sequel, so I want them to make as much money as possible. I want
Oh,
to
goodness.
Russian to watch the pirate version of Infinity War. I'm okay with that.
This is a conversation that we do not have the time for.
No. Anyways, but yeah, stay tuned in our Discord and our Instagram and Twitter for all those relevant announcements. And thanks, guys, for watching along. Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.